prepare for dynamic interactions. I've just hit the record button, so this way I'll upload it. I do not have the time to, one that goes into 1, 2, 3 hours. I do not have the time to sit and edit it for content. So it is going to be presented as is, in the sense that when I'm giving a live presentation, I do not have the ability to edit on the fly. Okay, so once again, welcome to BTEC 5322. We are looking for, the course is bioinformatics methodologies and applications. This course will be run online in a synchronous way. That means you will be able to listen to this lecture online while I'm giving the presentation. You will also be able to, then again, the YouTube videos will be made available. My name is Chiquito Crasta, if you hadn't already known it, and we are meeting Mondays 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Again, this is a synchronous course. I've got the chat open, so in case somebody has something to say, or alternatively, you can unmute and also kind of grab my attention. In addition, when I include the link, I will also include the PowerPoint for this presentation. This will typically be a PowerPoint style lecture. You can choose to take notes if you want to, but again, everything is being made available to you online. Everything that I talk about here, whether we go into a web base, whether a web resource, show you how to use a particular resource, no matter what we do, it's all going to be available for you. So you can take notes if you wish, but you don't have to. Okay, so once again, I have an alternate email in addition to the one that you have been communicating with. It's chiquito.crasto@gmail.com. In the off chance that the TTU email doesn't work, if there is ever an outage, then you can always go to gmail.com. I've at any time, if I'll get a notification on my desktop. I'll get a notification on my home desktop. I've got the apps on my phone, so if there's a notification, I should be able to find out. I'm actually pretty good. I'm pretty good at responding to emails. Those of you who have interacted with me will know this. So I'm very good at responding to. Let me just reorganize this a little bit so you can see a little better. Okay. And I'm in room 116 in the Experimental Sciences building. Now you have to specify it's Experimental Sciences building 1 as opposed to 2. So we are in the original Experimental Sciences building. It's if anybody's ever come to a conference or a lecture in room 120, my office is the one closest to it. Uh, no fixed office hours. If you ever had a question to ask or a comment to make that you wanted to share with me, then feel free to knock on the door, and it typically should be okay. But on the off chance that I'm in the middle of doing something, it's best that you just send me an email and say, hey, I'd like to come and meet you, and then I think for the most part it should be okay. Just want to let you know that my daughter is being homeschooled, so I'll give you some times. For example, on Thursday afternoon, after 2 o'clock, after 1:30, I'm not there. I'll come back. I have to drop her off to her two tutors that she has, and then most times she will be in my office. But so far, anybody, whether my research students or otherwise, have come to talk with me, uh, she'll just watch. She's just watching YouTube or something on the computer, other than a lesson time. That's and other kind of physical activities, extracurricular activities that she does. She's sitting in my office. There's not much we can do when it comes to homeschooling when both parents are kind of working full time. Okay, so once again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Okay, so all of this stuff will be sent to you, so you already know this information. Let's start. Let's start. a bioinformatics class, as in my opinion, most bioinformatics class should start with Latin. Okay. Now, this is a this is a uh, this is a general idea, okay, that you have to understand as a scientist, okay, that when we begin to work in the area of sciences at the frontier, right? Now, you're not an undergraduate, and granted, people have um, you have use of textbooks, and then you for your exams, homeworks, quizzes, etc., you regurgitate. When you're a graduate student, you are working at the frontiers of science, okay? And everything, therefore, is not deterministic, it is probabilistic, okay? The science of today that everybody believes in will be the trash of tomorrow because it'll have been debunked, it'll have been proven wrong. Instrumentation of today will be will be supplanted, replaced by better instrumentation, in which case your results will be very precise, more precise, until the next instrumentation comes along, and then it'll be then you'll say, well, okay, well, that was not right, so what I hung my hat on, what star I hitched my wagon to, didn't really pan out, right? So along with the understanding of working at the frontiers of science comes a little humility, and this is the reason why I use this example. So in the old days, hic sunt dracones is Latin for here be dragons. Okay, hic sunt dracones. What does that mean? When in the old days, when people used to, when the oceans of the world were being discovered, and you'd have these pioneer sailors taking their boats just with the sails, and then they would go out, they would venture, and then they would begin to map the oceans. Okay, as these unknown places were being mapped, they would eventually, when they came to the end of a particular place, and then they're like, well, we can't go any further, we have to turn back home, and but by drawing a map, we have now set the stage for other people. They would, in the map, the cartographers, the map developers, would actually literally put a picture of a dragon and say, here be dragons. Now, if you are a conspiracy theorist, you might say, well, they could actually potentially have found dragons or certain octopi, or certain mythical sea monsters or creatures were there and they found it. But I think what they were trying to say was, we have now hit that border between what is known, that is what has been mapped, to what is not known. Okay, and then we're just going to put a picture and say, while you dip your toes into the unknown, here be dragons. Okay, so I normally use this particular example to illustrate the point that there comes a certain humility with one of my mentors used to tell me, now they don't publish in a prestigious journal. As soon as they've made a discovery, the first thing they do is they call a press conference. Okay, and so this is something. And those of you, especially who are working on your PhDs, you have a greater stake in this because you're going to spend a lot more time. Certainly, you hit these points of being more highly qualified. Now, if all of this seems very esoteric to you, I will go to the next slide, and the next slide will illustrate this in a way that you would typically understand. Okay, and so when we look at the history of the atomic structure, okay, atomic structure is foundational to everything in chemistry and consequently biochemistry. Now, granted that none of you will be able to read any of the things that I'm pointing out here very clearly, but that's not the point. I think the point is, now typically what they say is that when you have uh, what is a generation? Okay, a generation is about 30 years. Between 30 to 35 years is the generation. That is when you have one group of parents, have babies, that's typically 30 years. And then they have babies, typically 30 years. Now look at the date that I'm pointing at. For example, 1803, what did John Dalton do? John Dalton came up with the proposition of what is an atom. Okay, oops, and he recommended the plum pudding model. Okay, he recommended the plum pudding model, and the plum pudding model indicated that it's like a pudding, like a cake, and that the nucleus was the big cake, and the little plums or raisins that were scattered around the cake were the electrons. Now, the reason I say this, now obviously that's been debunked because we've had instrumentation, we've had the infusion of quantum mechanics, we've had, going from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Those of you who don't know Heisenberg, I'm sure have seen, uh, what's that thing? What's that program called? Um, uh, so the point is, between this is three generations, about 100 years. Every scientist, every teacher, everybody who published a paper founded their entire notion on what is called the plum pudding model, the solid sphere model, where the sphere was basically the nucleus. Okay? Then once you had the solid sphere model, then an extension of the plum pudding model was created by J.J. Thomson. And J.J. Thomson did this about 100 years ago. So three generations of scientists and parents and children and students believed in this model, right? And the plum pudding model was a bit of an extension on the solid sphere model, that they said the nucleus, and then these were like raisins. And J.J. Thomson did a lot of work on experiments. Okay, then you had Ernst Rutherford. Now what happens is you begin to see an exponential takeoff in knowledge, because you have instrumentation, you have somebody opening the door to a new way of visualizing things, and you go from there, right? And so you have J.J. Thomson created the plum pudding model, okay, and he got the Nobel Prize. And then you have Ernst Rutherford, who basically said that the nucleus was this really concentrated, where the mass of the molecule was concentrated, and each proton was about 1836 or so times the mass of an electron, and the electrons were flying all over the place, so that the size of the atom was defined by the atoms, right? And then you had what is called Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr basically also, I think, won the Nobel Prize, but he talked about it being the electrons moving around in circular orbits around a where the mass was concentrated in the nucleus. Right now, the analogy that they drew was that this is the planetary model, and the planetary model placed the sun at the center of the solar system, just as every other star is a system of any astral system, and the electrons went in orbits, and they were held by gravitational pull of at various points. And then you have Erwin Schrödinger, who came up with the quantum model, which actually basically said that when you have what is called the wave-particle duality, where these things, electrons, etc., they behave as waves as well as particles, and they have this dual characteristic. Okay, and then you had somebody like a Sommerfeld, and you can extend this. You can have the Sommerfeld, who said that, well, some of these that the Niels Bohr model worked really well and explained the behavior of hydrogen. The moment you went to helium, and helium's weird because helium does not interact with anything because it's got that complete quantum shell. But on the other hand, you might have somebody called as Sommerfeld, who extended it because they realized that Niels Bohr's model did not work for once you went to lithium, right? Because the interactions became a lot more, and then Schrodinger basically had his time-dependent and independent time-independent Schrodinger equation. I'm trained as a chemist, so some of the quantum mechanics that I've picked up along the way kind of give some of this. But the point I'm trying to make in all of this is that what you're doing right now is 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 maybe at the frontiers of your science, but is not necessarily deterministic. It's probabilistic. Somewhere in your own careers, you'll go ahead and then you'll find that the science or the knowledge that we have evolves. Okay, now, does this have anything to do with bioinformatics? Actually, it does not. Okay, it does not have anything to do with bioinformatics. It has to do with the philosophy of how you approach this work. I'm presenting to you my philosophy that have evolved over the years. So when somebody tells you, we are saying this, the science is settled, move on. Okay? And therefore you cannot question it the moment you question it. Okay? And all about science is questioning. And all about science is about challenging notions. And it's about not just saying the how, but also saying the why. And if you do not get a satisfactory response, then a theory is null and void, right? So, for example, as I said, 100 years people believed nothing but a very incomplete model of what a of what an atom is. Okay, and now we've come here, and this is still 100 years ago. Okay, so beyond that, there have been small changes here and there, spectroscopic measurements, etc. But again, it's an evolving science, and 100 years from now, everything that we know is not necessarily. So again, a little humility, especially if you're working with that when you're working at the frontiers, because if you go backwards, understand that you are dipping your toes into the unknown, right? And again, this is just a generic thing I would include with everything else. Now, speaking of the science being settled, here are some instructions about COVID. I'm going to include them. I don't think the fear that we used to have is as palpable anymore, but it's still. Let me make this the entire screen readable as best I can. Okay, I think that should be fine. Um, but I think that and now let me make my ego a little prominent. Um, and again, all the information that you need for COVID is here. Now, if you were in a face-to-face class, I would just basically make the declaration that uh, probably the only one on the planet who's not vaccinated, and I would then make a joke and say that please don't run away. I'm not as infective as you think I am. My attitude um, has been basically diametrically opposite for of everything that has been conventionally held true. So I'm not going to, beyond that, I'm not going to comment too much. But again, if the university has policies in place and if you feel you've got COVID, if you feel you're sick or something like that, these are policies. Now, these are policies that were instituted, uh, when this was in the 2019, 2019, 1921, 1922, so 2 or 3 years ago. But I think all the links should just as fine. Of course, now COVID really didn't get cured, but everybody seems to have moved on from it. Okay, any brickbats? Anybody mad at what? Anybody mad at me for what I said? So again, so this is something that everybody has to think about. Okay, what are the topics that are going to be covered in this class? Now, this class also remember is going to extend through the end of the semester. That is, this is not a session one, session two class. It's a class which runs for the entire thing. Now, so the foundation parts of the class is that today's class we're going to look at an introduction to bioinformatics. We're going to look at an introduction to bioinformatics and how it differs from computational biology. We are going to look at what a bioinformatician does, what a bioinformaticist does, And you'll realize that that at the end of this class, you will have come no closer to a definition of what any of these things are than when you began. But because you're going to learn bioinformatics, at least it's nice to have a world view. It's nice to have your finger on the pulse of what the evolution of the process is, and how people have considered it, and how bioinformatics has evolved and things like that. Okay. All right. So that's today's class. What we're going to do is, irrespective of what your personal opinions are on what bioinformatics is, I want to give you a thorough grounding. Okay, this is probably the only class within the university at TTU or at HSC that actually gives you a full rundown. So we're not going to specialize in anything. There are other classes that specialize in this, and I'll point those to you. If you feel the need to, just to encourage you to take those classes, if you want to stay in bioinformatics a little, I'll even tell you any companion experimental classes that are available that you need to do. But this will take you through what we understand as classical bioinformatics, right from the time where bioinformatics came into being, right up to genomics bioinformatics, which is now what is traditionally the more popular bioinformatics, and everybody seems to be jumping on the bandwagon to get onto that kind of bioinformatics. And this includes next generation sequencing, and again, our Center for Biotechnology and Genomics, which is my home department or center, if you will. We do a lot of services, and we've acquired a lot of instrumentation, and I would say that right now we are at the cutting edge, with the caveat that we're looking at a probabilistic situation here. Okay, and so with the genomics bioinformatics, we'll fall right into the high throughput sequencing methods, which is next generation sequencing. And the HPCC course, whenever a HPCC course is announced, I'm not going to teach it, but how to use a Linux system, how to familiarize yourself with the Linux system, how to use high performance computing, all of these, this is a course that is conducted by HPCC, and I think they have one every semester. I will send you the information when it becomes available. If something is available, and I will send it to you right away, and you will be required to attend a session. Okay, so I'm not going to teach it, but understand that you have to kind of begin to evolve your thinking beyond Windows, or double click, but you have to learn how to use a what's called a slurm, how to set up a high performance computing to do a complicated process. Nothing complicated other than learn how to use the basics of a Linux system, how to get away from double click and you're going to get a window that opens and does stuff. Okay, so and this is something that you have to that information will be emailed to you. And after that, we're going to have an midterm, and the midterm will typically be, depending on how the midterm is and how I assess the level of difficulty of the questions, you will either be given a week or a weekend. Okay, and if you have any issues, then you can always let me know. Now, just want to let you know that some of you probably have come into with some background bioinformatics. You've done it in, if some of you have already been in graduate school for a while, if some of you have had bioinformatics in undergraduate, so there might be some repetition. You might say, oh, I learned this, I know how to do this. Okay, but I want to let you know that this course is taught at a graduate level. Okay, so the things that you will learn, the homeworks that you will work on, the midterm levels, etc., will be at a slightly higher level. It'll be a little more challenging. It won't be hard so much as it'll require you to think. Sometimes when you look at a problem, it might seem, wow, this is difficult, I can't do it. But the idea is to train you as a researcher, right? That you look for, just like you deal with your master's or PhD research problem, you approach a homework or a midterm by saying, okay, this is the problem. It has to be an evolved a way of working towards it, and eventually a solution will begin to fall out. And so this is basically takes you through classical bioinformatics, this takes you through the current bioinformatics, and then this is really not an introduction to biostatistics so much, but just a foundational introduction to statistics. And this is a very important course. And this time I'll also point you to other people who teach biostatistics. This is a course, a lecture in clinical informatics. I might actually get a guest lecture to give this talk. And this is again, bioinformatics is all pervasive. It's everywhere, right? Again, I always make this point. If you're walking around with a cell phone, you have the combined knowledge of since the beginning of time. You have it in your, you're walking around with it in your purse, your pocket, um, you know and now what you tend to use it for is a whole different thing, but it's there. Okay, it's there. Then we can also talk. This is actually a fun lecture on knowledge management. This is it tells you some of the challenges, gives you some of the background, and this is actually a fun lecture where I introduce you to the basic notions of, what is knowledge, how does one represent knowledge, how does one present information, how does one disseminate the information to everybody, how do you store it in a logical way, and then we'll actually touch very briefly on to kind of AI systems and automated systems for knowledge management. And then we will study proteomics informatics. And proteomics informatics, it has to do obviously with proteins, but we'll go back and look at things like structure of DNA, etc., as just to kind of give you an idea. You might learn a little bit about mass spec, and also metabolomics. And if I just give you a teaser on these things, then I certainly will point you to a place where you can learn more. Okay, so this is an introductory class which basically is all encompassing, touches on various aspects of bioinformatics, but is not necessarily dives really deep. Okay. However, you will have enough. I will show you enough data. I will give you enough homeworks where you won't really just walk away saying, well, I just know the basics. You'll actually get some foundational grounding into something a little more deeper. Okay, as I said, we're teaching this class at a graduate level, and then you'll have a final. Now, the final is something that I will decide. There might be a two-step final. There might be a take-home component to it. There might be also a component where the exam is sent to you and you have 3 hours to complete it, you know, on your own. If on the other hand, I might just say, okay, for this particular class, everybody has to show up at a given agreed time, and you will all take the test in class, completely closed book, etc. Okay, so there could be more than one part to this exam. All right, I am looking at the chat right now and I don't see any questions. If on the other hand you have any questions about the topics, how things are going to be covered, etc., then feel free to either unmute and ask me, or send it in chat. And chat is fine, because again, sometimes you ask a question and everybody benefits from that answer. Yes, no. Can anybody raise their hand to make sure you're still around? Okay, thank you, Michaela. All right, moving on then. I've already said that the link to the video, the files to this class will be emailed to you, uh, unedited, obviously. So that's basically exactly how you're listening to me. If any hesitance, if there's a cough, if you see me stop to take a sip of water, I'm not going to edit any of that out. Okay, so this is what you see is what you get, because I'd rather you have the information before you. And in the YouTube video, if some of you have a hearing impairment or anything, then we could obviously, you can always do a closed captioning which automatically does it. And I think the Google systems are probably the best for this. Um, if you have any questions, obviously you can ask me. Uh, I might send you additional reading material that is required, and sometimes the reading material I might also have an impromptu quiz that you'll then submit to me, return to me, and once I get the email, then we can continue. So there's all lots of things happening. You almost invariably have a homework of some kind at every class. Okay. So the grading is class participation, homework, quizzes and homework come under the same thing, and then you're going to have a midterm, and then you're going to have a final. Okay. Um, so what does class participation mean? So in class participation, if you interrupt and ask questions, it's a good thing. If you challenge me, it's a good thing. If you challenge me and ask me a question, and I don't know the answer, that's an even better thing, because that prompts, again, remember, I'm teaching a class, fine. I'm not, but I'm, in terms of the knowledge, I'm not the be all and end all, know it all of bioinformatics, right? It's, again, when we work at the frontiers, we are in an evolving field. Knowledge becomes available, etc. So this is something that so these are the bonus points. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you've gotten bonus points, but when I grade, there is always bonus points. There are always bonus points column that I put in there. And whenever at the end of the class I think about a student, somebody's asked me something, etc., then they get bonus points. Now, if somebody asks a question and one of the students asks a question and somebody responds to a student, that is perfectly fine, right? Because what happens is this class is being taught as a generalist, right? Now, if each of you has more experience in your master's or your PhD or your particular specializations, and if you can provide a perspective that I can't, and your perspective is better, you're welcome. Okay, that's not. This is not where you say that, oh, just because I'm the teacher I know it all and things like that. No, this is everybody's kind of, has certain specialization. And as you go through your masters and your PhD, you'll realize that your area of specialization becomes narrower and narrower, to the point that it's a single line, which is the title of your dissertation or your thesis or your, whatever research project you do. If I have communications from you that are intelligent, ask questions, are challenging, because, well, you couldn't ask that in class, but you can ask that via an email, or you can stop by, knock on the door, and we talk about something. That's perfectly okay too. You'll get bonus points. And then, now you have only 6 students in this class, and one hasn't shown up today. So I don't know whether, that all the first three. But if you somebody who's diligent and who's always submitting things early, you're going to get bonus points. Now, I'm not going to tell you how many bonus points. I'm not going to say I'm going to assign 2 points for this, or 3 points for this, or 4 points of this. I'm going to keep it completely non-transparent. Everything about this class is transparent, because I don't want people to just say, well, I'm going to do this because of a bonus point. Okay. Now, in terms of homework, I'd rather you not turn in your homework in a hurried, haphazard way, just to get the bonus points, and then make mistakes and leave yourself, without without that additional information, right? I would rather you do the homework correctly and not worry about the time. If, on the other hand, you end up submitting early, then there will be bonus points for you. Okay. The homework is typically, pretty much anything I can think of which is immediately relevant to that day's class. Again, it's a challenging and a graduate level. Sometimes we also use, uh, if we do a certain we work on a certain web page, then or a web resource, a bioinformatics web resource, we'll be exploring, obviously not in a comprehensive way everything, but the primary resources that you would typically see. We will explore all of those, or most of those at least. And the idea is that, you know, and I'll talk to that when I talk to the last slide in this today's lecture, and that is what is called the philosophical underpinnings of this class. Okay, so they will be challenging. Now uh, the I don't know how much each of you know each other. You know, whether you work in the same lab. Certainly, everybody seems to have come here from a diverse perspective. But if you want to get together and work on the homeworks together, at least in terms of sharing concepts and things like that, that is perfectly okay. Okay. But once you're ready to write or type out your homework, then you have to go separately and do it. So colluding and collaborating, at least at a conceptual level, helping each other out on homeworks is perfectly fine. Okay, but don't copy off of each other. Now, again, you can respond to me as a Word document, a PDF document, or whatever it is required. You can actually get Acrobat Professional, so you can do that. But I suspect you already have this. What I do is I add the quizzes, homeworks, midterms, finals together, but I might actually choose to weight things. Uh, you know, I don't typically like to weight things. I just add everything because the idea is the end result has to reflect your performance across the board. Okay. I'm not one of these people who is going to say you get a 90 plus to get an A, and then 80 to get a B, and then somebody gets an 89 and they get a B. I will actually assess the overall student performance. I will, if somebody does exceptionally well, as people have always said in my class, it's very hard to get an A plus, but it's also equally hard to fail. If you show some promise, if you show some engagement, if you do the work on time, then you typically will not fail. Okay, but I'm not one of these people who said the moment I see a 55, that's a D, or a 60, or a 69, that's an F, or a 69 is a D, or a 79 is a C. I don't do that. Okay, I will curve it. Generally, people are pretty happy about the overall grades they get. Uh, I have on occasion failed people, so it's not like it's this class is an easy pass. Academic misconduct, we take this very, very, very strictly. As you can see, things are getting read. Work individually as assigned. If I say homework, I've just very specifically said if you want to work together, sometimes people text each other, email each other, perfectly fine. You want to get together for a study session, that's perfectly fine. I do not interfere in any of these activities. When it comes to midterms and finals, however, you have to work by yourself, even if it's a take home. Last time, when I taught this class last fall, I I found that some people had worked together. There was no way to mistake it. It was a class of about 20, 22 students, and other than about 4 or 5 students, they worked on the midterm together. And they, of course, when I say work, they helped each other out, and then they went separately and tried to answer the question. But I know exactly because you're looking for independent individual thinking. You are not looking for people who are just going to work together. Okay, so again, I'm not saying that when I hand over the midterm to you that you are not going to you're not going to you're completely on your own. That's not what I said at all. If you have questions as far as when it comes to midterms and things like that, you come to me and you ask me questions. You can even ask me, hey, am I on the right track? Now, without giving you any clues, without giving you any additional help that might be unfair to somebody who didn't come to me, I'll help you. Okay? Just do not work with everybody else, because bad things happen. And then what happened was we met, and I mentioned that that I'm quite sure that that some of you work together. A goodly number of you form these little groups, cabals, whatever, and work together on the exam. And so then people got mad at me. They thought that I was just making these accusations. Okay, and so let's not get into that unpleasant situation, but um, but I will, so very strict about that, right? Again, if you have difficulties, bring them to me. Uh, Homeworks you can discuss with each other, but then you've got to work by yourself. I already mentioned that. The take home midterm and the finals alone. Now, what happened was, once I realized that people worked together on the midterm and then kind of went separately, they used the homework collusion formula, collaboration formula for the midterm. I wasn't happy at all. And then I gave them an in-class, completely closed notes. If you had the take-home midterm, you will not have to work on you will not have to you can use open notes, open books, open internet, open anything, unrestricted way, right? But the because eventually I kind of got mad that people were had worked together on midterms. I decided that I want to give an in-class final exam. Anybody wants to? Should I take a poll, Microsoft Team poll, on what the average grade was uh, of the final exam? Anybody wants to in chat guess? Well, Michaela, below average is, first of all, we have to define what an average is before we decide what below average is. I want people to just, furiously type and tell me what you think the average the average was. No, it wasn't compared to the take-home average. I just said your exams out of 100. No, actually, the average was a 63, which means the average was a D. Okay. Now, did I kind of the question that might arise? Did I get mad and give everybody a really hard midterm? No, I didn't. Everything I could point to, everything came from the slides. Everything came from the slide. There was nothing in there that, but people just didn't study, right? And so that's basically what happened. The average was a 63. So bad things happen. So the idea is never get yourself into that situation. Ask me if you have any questions. Okay? Penalties. You might if I find out and we can prove that you've done something. You've conducted yourself in a way that you can go an F, expulsion from school, Fs and things like that. Which brings us to AI. Okay. Now, as I see in this slide, you'll see that there is no fixed TTU policy. Okay. There is a big struggle right now as to what the policy should be or shouldn't be, and I think, um, I don't know what that policy is. Um, but in this class, you're not allowed to go to ChatGPT. You are not allowed to go to Grok. You're not allowed to go to Copilot. You are not allowed to go to Google Gemini. If you do, it's not allowed. Okay, so again, you won't have to go to Google Colab because my next class, the advanced bioinformatics class that I teach, BTEC 5333, is a programming class. You're going to learn a lot of programming and some additional stuff. So again, in that, so Google Colab will not necessarily apply here, but it's not allowed. Now I'll give you an example of what is very disheartening. Uh, a colleague of mine taught a spring class. Let's not worry about what the class is or what the colleague's name is. So she was very disheartened because she said she had a final project and everybody she said sorry she had 13 students and 11 out of 13 students used ChatGPT to create their final exam. Okay, so this goes into a little bit of a challenging notion of what is the point of it, right? You have to ask yourself, are you here to learn something? Are you here to learn something? That means you have to push yourself, understanding that once you've done something, you've made yourself better than what you began, right? So, for example, you came up with some notions of bioinformatics, or you knew no bioinformatics, and you walk away saying, now I know some bioinformatics. You say, I don't know how to use some of the bioinformatics tools, to I know how to use bioinformatics tools. And everything that you do, even when it's non-academic, where it's an extracurricular thing you do, or a hobby that you have, whether it's at an emotional level, an intellectual level, a physical level, if you go out and jog and things like that, at every level you are enriching yourself. Okay. Now, along the way, you can seek help. Okay. But if you say, I'm just going to make an entity do my work for me, well, then you have no personal enrichment. You're going through a process. You're using an expeditious method by which you want to make something, um, you want to get a result, get a grade, and move on. But in expediting that process, you're walking away not enriched. You almost might just say, I'm just going to go to an online class somewhere, an online degree, and I'll basically let everything rip through an AI system, and it's going to give me results, and I'm going to turn it in, and I'm going to walk away with my degree. And then you have to ask yourself, right? Look, a lot of this, the first two slides when I talked about the dragons in cartography, or the study of the atom, right? In terms of our evolution of our understanding of what the definition of an atom is, it's all about evolving. It's all about getting better. It doesn't mean that I clearly told you that everything that you think is right will necessarily be wrong 10 years from now. Okay. So the humility that comes is also about, but does it mean that we don't try it because it's going to be wrong anyway? No, because you're using a combination of intellect and talent and the ability to work hard and put your nose to the grindstone. You're doing all of this to ensure that you are enriching yourself, right? I don't know whether anybody's ever heard of this this story of it's deep in kind of equatorial Africa, where there was this teacher who was teaching these kids, and and at the end of the class, this one student wanted to give the teacher a gift. Okay, now being in there's not a lot in terms of gift, uh, novel in terms of gifts. So this student decided to give the teacher a handful of sand. Now a handful of sand was not available in the milieu around it, so they decided that they wanted to go to the seashore. The seashore, however, was a 3-day walk through jungles and forests and animals and fraught with danger. So this student undertakes that, picks up a handful of sand, and returns and gives it to the teacher, right? So what is the gift? Certainly a handful of sand is not worthy, right? It's not worthy of anything. It's got no monetary value. And so you've often heard this adage, the journey is the journey is the reward, right? So the effort that the student put to give something essentially worthless is the reward. Okay, and that's the kind of enrichment you want to see. Now, there's a whole bunch of school of thought that says that AI is now going to take over everything. AI is going to take over jobs. Why can't they train a system to do the job? Why do you need humans? And at some point, somewhere along the line, you'll all decide something, some entity out there is going to decide that you're all replaceable. That whatever your avocation is, whatever you decide to do with your life, there's a machine that can do it better, more efficiently, without getting tired, right? So it's a very slippery slope that we're on, but until that takes over, at least use every opportunity for personal enrichment. That's the philosophical view. The practical view is when I give a question, I am going to make sure that I put it into every AI system. So I already know what the AI is going to answer. Okay. Now, the reason I also understand this better is because I was one of the first developers of a machine learning system in in neuroscience. My paper is one of the first. So I also understand foundationally what any of this means. Okay, so again, take the trouble. It's the journey is worth it. Okay, now can ChatGPT write something that's grammatically correct? Right, possibly. Can it can it put together an impressive document? Probably. Right, but you are going to provide what is you, with all the idiosyncrasies and frailties and everything associated with that. Yeah, so I'd rather you not just for my sake, for the sake of this class, but also for your sake. Okay. Uh, Now I'm completely okay if you start typing your work in Google Documents, and then anything on a web-based system, and you have probably what's that software which actually makes grammar corrections and things like that for you. That's perfectly okay. To help you as you type along. I always was so proud of my own writing abilities that I thought I didn't need it. And then it's like whenever I write an email, it's correcting me, and I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't even think about this, right? So again, but to just make an AI system, just say I'm just going to dump it into ChatGPT and I'm completely happy with what it is. So it's this war of attrition, right? It's You're always fighting, and the fights are saying that okay, a ChatGPT is going to do something, and that's too easy. So why don't I give a question? Why don't I frame my question in such a way that ChatGPT cannot answer it, right? So this is where we are right now. Right now we are in this middle stage where you know we use AI for things that make our life easier. But at least in this class, I want you to give of yourself, not have a machine system do it for you. All right, attendance. We've got about, I think it's like every course is a 14 day thing, a 14-week thing, but we've got 12 lecture days. I know who's absent. I know who's present. Oops.
Raging.
Yes, please. Please. Okay, show of hands. Are we back? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Malin. Yeah, for some weird reason, I had set it up for a three thing. So we might be interrupted once again. So let me make sure that we don't get interrupted, and I'll find out what Microsoft Teams. Anyway, thanks for raising your hands, guys. Again, so if you have if you have more than two absences, then I'm going to have to ask you to withdraw from the class. Just because there's a little bit of discipline that comes with some of this. Uh, you don't. I mean, if you cannot come to class for any reason, some of you have. In fact, we had two students who couldn't join this class because they came from the animal sciences, and then they had a big summer project coming up, and then they couldn't dedicate the time, and therefore they kind of walked away from the class. But if you have any questions, please do not. Like if you have a let me contact Iman. If you have any questions, if you have any issues, like, you know, let me know. If you're going for a conference, etc., let me know in advance that you can't come. If, on the other hand, something happens, like a medical emergency or any other emergency, please do not feel obliged to tell me, okay? When things settle down, then you can just let me know, hey, I couldn't come because so and so thing happened. Okay, so very, very important that you show up to class. Let's take a 5 minute break, and we will come back, and now we will work on the bioinformatics side of things. Okay.
Zejdziecie, żeby elektryczny nasadzić i pokój. Tam ci bawię.
Wait, so can you guys?
All right, back. Okay, we're back. Anybody, any questions before we begin? All right, thank you very much. All right, so if if you weren't already aware, this is a class on bioinformatics, and we're going to do methodologies and applications. And as indicated before, we have all kinds of definitions, sub-definitions, etc. within bioinformatics. As I said, I also teased you and promised you that by the end of this lecture, you will be no closer to a proper definition of bioinformatics than you were before. All right. Having said that, let us look at this parable, and this encapsulates bioinformatics, the definition in a really nice way. The reference is there, and it's called the six blind men and the elephant. Okay, some people have called it the six blind men from India, six blind men from China. I think the point is still the same. So there were six blind men, and they were asked to touch the elephant and give a description of the elephant as best they could. And so each of these blind men touched one part of the elephant, and they decided that that's what an elephant looks like. So you can see that the person who touched the trunk decided that, well, the elephant might look like a snake, or somebody, touched the ears and said it looks like a rug or a carpet. And I've heard alternate versions of this, that they said that um, the man who touched the ears said that it looked like a fan. Somebody touched the tusk and said the thing looked like a spear or an arrow. Okay, somebody touched the leg and said it looked was the elephant might because the legs of the elephant feels like a tree trunk, The elephant probably looks like a tree. And then somebody touched the side of the elephant and decided that the elephant might look like a wall. And then the last guy touches the tail, holds on to the tail of the elephant, and says that the elephant feels like a rope, right? So, as you can see, that even if you created a composite of all the things that they describe the elephant to be, it still wouldn't look like the elephant, right? And that's kind of the challenge we face when we have to come up with a definition of what is bioinformatics. Okay, all right. So let's take a look at what bioinformatics is, and the earliest definition of what not called bioinformatics at that time, but what was potentially bioinformatics was a computational biological medicine medical paper, interactive instruction on population interactions. And so here's a key definition, and that one can look at it and says, it seemed to us that one of the defining properties of life was the information. And this is one of only the first time I'm going to read the statement in its entirety. But in other cases, you don't have to, I'll just show you what's there. I might not even read everything because I think the idea is to make a point that you have all these processes that happen, right? Information transmission from DNA to intra and intercellular processes, and the interpretation of such information at multiple levels, which you understand is a typical metabolic biological process. At a minimum, we felt that it was information processing and could serve as a useful metaphor for understanding living systems, right? So you take the processing that happens in a biological system, and then you basically analogize it to processing that takes place in a computational system, right? And because now you're bringing the two together, the idea was, why can't we use one to mimic the creation of the other? Okay. And so what Pauline Hogeway, uh, in this PubMed article, said the roots of bioinformatics are here. Now, this is, as you can see, somebody might say, well, the word bioinformatics was not used, but certainly what we come to understand is bioinformatics, or whatever definition of it, or whatever part of the elephant you're hanging on to, is a definition that is a definition that was alluded to. Now, oh, just want to remind you, if we get if we get kicked out of if we get kicked out of it again, as will happen in another hour, just remember that we can just log back on, okay? Log back on to that link. Okay, now we call it a disputed origin because that was in 1978, and here there was something in 1999. The term bioinformatics is used to encompass almost all computer applications and biological sciences, but was originally coined in the mid 1980s. Well, we don't know that is the mid 1980s because I just showed you there was an illusion in 1978. So that would be towards the end of the 1970s, right? So again, the disputed origins could just mean, that the term bioinformatics was never used, and all the references that you would need are here. The big challenge, though, you have to ask yourself is, if you want to create a definition of bioinformatics, think about it from the perspective of, how can I make a definition that is very, very succinct? Can I define, biology, for example, would be the study of all living things right now. All the subdivisions and categories and the complexities and the various aspects of the biological sciences are a whole different thing, right? But in terms of bioinformatics, you say, how does one define it? On the other hand, if you want to take into account everything, right? I'll give you, this is an example that's good. Everybody knows what a Facebook icon is, right? Everybody knows what a Facebook icon is. Um, it's just that F, right? The sans serif F. And if you see that white against a kind of a light or medium blue background, you know that is Facebook, right? And you know that's the icon for Facebook. Also, if you have an envelope with red borders, it's Gmail, right? Now, Gmail does a lot of things, right? Gmail, in addition to emails and stores everything as a conversation, is a completely different style. It allows you, it has a drive, a Google Drive. It can allows you to access Drive. It allows you to share information. It allows you to use Google Meets for an interaction much like this. But again, you don't. All you need to know is that little bit of that symbol, right? This whole notion of iconography arises from something like that. Is that the icon, or for example, you know exactly what Twitter used to be, a bird, and now it's changed to X. So you have the X, but you should be able to differentiate the X from Twitter to the standard letter X, right? So again, so the idea is, can we take bioinformatics and then use a very succinct definition? On the other hand, if we want to use a definition that's all encompassing, well, then that definition gets really big, because you're like, well, what if you miss that point? Or what if I say, well, you know, you talked about DNA, but what about proteins? You know, that's part of informatics too. And then somebody says, well, that, but then what about the development of algorithms? You know, and so you say, well, by that token, if you start adding to make sure that your definition and takes into account everything that bioinformatics is about, well, then the definition is never going to end. So how does one give a succinct one line or two line or a single sentence definition of bioinformatics, right? And so we can keep going in terms of the disputed, you know, that the term official bioinformatics did not appear until 1991. Whereas on the other hand, the illusion, like developing algorithms to make biological discoveries by sequence analysis, that people were talking about in the 1960s. Okay, so again, so this is trends in bioinformatics. All right, so let's look at the definition of bioinformatics. And when in doubt, you go to Wikipedia. So let's see what Wikipedia. It's simple again. You know, I'm not necessarily going to say don't use Wikipedia, as they always say. And the only reason why people say don't use Wikipedia is because, and I'm not talking about the political thing where people can go in and put their own own information, and some of it is lies and some of it is true and things like that. So I'm just talking about a typical science in an undisputed way. But even there, you know, so let's just look for definitions. All right. So bioinformatics is an interdisciplinary field that develops methods and software tools for understanding biological data. As an interdisciplinary field of science, bioinformatics combines computer science, statistics, mathematics, and engineering to analyze and interpret biological data. Okay, that's fine. No point in just kind of reading this. So is that a specific example, a specific definition, or more of a generic definition? So I would say this would fall under the case of a generic definition. But you already see that the definition is kind of becoming a little big, right? Now it's gone beyond like a single sentence, but it's becoming now, because you want to qualify it that as to, yes, it's an interdisciplinary study, but it's about developing methods and software tools to understand biological data. Some people might say, well, you know, yes, granted that all knowledge typically comes from experiments, and we use informatics to expedite the process, make things fast, process large amounts of data. But what about using bioinformatics to make discoveries, right? So then you might say, well, this particular definition ignores that. All right, so let's look at another general definition. So again, bioinformatics derived from genetic code. So now they're going to genetics, patients, so the clinical bioinformatics, retrieval and analysis of bioinformatics data. Okay, and now it's a generic definition that basically goes into using informatics, which is most information science, statistics, math, chemistry, biochemistry, physics, and linguistics. Where did linguistics suddenly come from? Right now as you guys become more and more adept at AI and machine learning, you say, if I can use linguistics, which is basically AI, that is the natural language, then then you know, now you begin to understand it. 5 years ago, AI was not very popular. People didn't understand. This definition still holds. So, what is the definition of linguistics? It's a study of a language, its structure, the study of the morphology, the construction, grammar, the syntax, what something sounds like, and the semantics, that is, the relationships between different phrases and all the connectivities which allow us to understand, you know, different things. Okay? So it has many practical applications in the area of the biology and medicine. Then there are other fields, for example, medical imaging, image analysis, which this does not take into account, is also considered part of bioinformatics. There is a whole other discipline of biologically inspired computation. for example, neural networks, right? Neural networks is how do neural network? Neural network seeks to make the connectivities, because if you look at our brain, there are our brain cells are called neurons, and all the messages that are passed from one to the other to the other to the other are done by means of neurons, right? So the question is, why can't we develop software which actually mimics the neural networks? Okay, now you have what is called a tight definition of bioinformatics, and that is like a more succinct, specific definition, and the mathematical, statistical, and computing methods that aim to solve biological problems using DNA and amino acid sequences and related information. But you see here, when you look at, for example, what we look at in terms of related information, right? Related information, you see here related information is, it almost feels like, yes, they could have said more, but they want to keep the definition really, really specific, so they just lumped everything else into related information. All right, now let's look at the important people, the NIH. Okay, so now if you see, well, why is this looks small? It's not, right? So bioinformatics is a field of science in which biology, computer science, information technology merge into a single discipline. There are three important subdisciplines within bioinformatics: the development of new algorithms, statistics, and then there's a whole bunch of, the definition doesn't end there, because I've just used ellipsis to say that this is a continued definition, right? Because now it says that we have to look into protein structures and nucleotides and, right, the golden rule, right? The golden rule of molecular biology. You start with DNA, you go to messenger RNA, and then you go to proteins, right? So you can't really create a definition that ignores one of the parts of the golden rule of molecular biology. Okay, other definitions. So let's see: computational biology, computer database and algorithm for speeding up and enhancing biological. Then biologists use computers, or the other way around. Bioinformatics is more of a tool than a discipline, right? So then you have to ask yourself, is it a field of study, or do we just take a bunch of computer science people and we tell them, here's a problem, this is the nature of the data, why don't you solve this problem by writing a computer program to do that, right? And in which case then you say, well, then the computing to any kind of discovery by itself is not there, right? Okay, so here are the keywords, okay, which kind of get repeated again and again and again. Okay, and so again, now we look at the dictionary definitions. Merriam-Webster says the collection, classification, storage, and analysis of biochemical and biological information using computers. But this is about collection, classification, and storage. And certainly one of my postdoctoral work involved what is called the Human Brain Project. And the Human Brain Project was purely about, one aspect of it was purely about, developing databases, because how does one take all that information, store it in a logical way, and organize it in such a way that it can be disseminated efficiently. More importantly, that was the time where the internet was becoming popular, so how does one disseminate it on the internet using the World Wide Web, so people all over the world can take a look at it. Okay, the Oxford English Dictionary has something slightly different. Conceptualizing biology in the sense of physical chemistry, so this is completely different. And applying informatics techniques to understand and organize the information with these molecules on a large scale. In short, bioinformatics is a management information system for molecular biology and has many practical applications. So once again, I'm not expecting you to walk out of this particular class and say, I know what Merriam-Webster said and I know exactly how it can be. I think we have to look at it from a larger perspective, and the larger perspective is, what are the struggles between doing an all-encompassing definition which does not miss out on a single application, right? Like, take the entire elephant, whereas others are saying, let's come up with something a little more succinct, and then are you in danger of losing on important information, right? Are you then missing out on something? Because somebody can say, well, that's not bioinformatics at all, and I'll give you a personal example of that. Okay, so the Oxford English Dictionary was supplied, it came from a paper by somebody I know, Mark Yerstein, who's at Yale, and it was published here, right? So they published this, They published this in one of their papers about 24 years ago, and then the Oxford English Dictionary picked up this definition. So let's talk a little bit more because we're going back and forth in terms of some of these examples. So let's look at what they're trying to say in this particular paper. And what this graph does is it basically it what this figure does is it represents the kind of the golden rule of molecular biology, right? So where is the informatic aspects here, right? So you've got a juxtaposition, a meeting of genomics and proteomics. So here you have the genomics, right? You've got sequence, and you'll see in the figure when I share the slides with you, you've got pairwise comparison, sequence alignment, multiple alignment, and we're going to look at all of these things, templates, databases, etc., of DNA. And then you look at the DNA getting translated into a protein sequence. And then you say the protein has a structure, and then the structure is associated with a particular surface. And then this is where the physical chemistry comes in. You look at the force fields, the interactability of that particular protein, then you interact it with the ligand complex, and now you start entering into that area of what is drug design, for example, right? So drug design is the creation of an organic molecule of a different type that you know will interact with a particular protein receptor, right? And does whatever it is does. And in this case, there's all kinds of the which is proteomics and metabolomics more from a structural standpoint. So this is their definition, and the reason why the physical chemistry term comes into being, the physical chemistry that I'm pointing here, is because here when you look at force fields and things like that, you begin to use methodologies of what is called ensemble determinations. That means you're looking at this from the perspective of statistical thermodynamics, okay? And that is where you begin to think in terms of force fields, because we are looking at large molecules, large numbers of molecules interacting with each other. So now what happens is the typical dynamics, the thermodynamics that you learn, which is two hydrogens interacting with each other, or a hydrogen and a chlorine interacting with each other, and therefore we have to calculate the Gibbs free energy and look at the entropy changes and the enthalpy changes, etc. Now you begin to say, well, that is all great, but statistical thermodynamics using Boltzmann statistics, etc., takes these single interaction that you can write on a piece of paper as a chemical reaction into several millions of these interacting with each other. So now you basically take that into statistics, and all of that is a study which comes under the category of physical chemistry. Okay, so again, as I said, you're going to be no closer. You're going to be no closer to a definition, but it's good to know what other people think. Now, just to give you a kind of a personal example, I was a postdoc and I was looking for jobs, and I went to we lived in Connecticut, and we went to a job in New York, and this was to be a bioinformatics journalist. And I said, hey, why not? I'm the right person for the job. Turns out I wasn't, but fine. So I go to this in one of the high rises, and I told my wife, I said, I don't know what kind of job interview this is going to be, but let's just go and, after this interview, spend a night, spend an evening doing something in New York, and then take the late train back home to Connecticut. And so, uh, and I was involved in kind of database development and structural proteomics and using of high computing systems and protein ligand interactions, and that was my research at that time, and also a little bit of developing information retrieval, and we learn about all of these things in subsequent lectures. And this guy came to I went for the interview, so I was like, hey, my wife is sitting outside. He's like, you brought your wife to a job interview? So I right away knew that it's not going to go well. So anyway, he says, what do you understand by bioinformatics? And I told him everything I understood about bioinformatics. And this is the time when you learn in terms of a classical bioinformatics perspective. You'll see that this was the time when sequence analysis and multiple sequence analyses and all of those things were, that is what bioinformatics was again. So this is a blind man touching the touching the side of the elephant and thinking that the elephant looked like a wall. Meanwhile, I came from the perspective of touching the tusk of the elephant and deciding that the elephant looked like a spear. So he immediately cuts me off and he says, no, no, that's not bioinformatics at all. When we think in bioinformatics, I think in terms of sequences and things like that. So again, and what he was saying in from that perspective is correct, because that was all everybody, when they defined bioinformatics, that's what they said. If you look at bioinformatics today, nobody will even talk in terms of bioinformatics other than, you want to be able to do genomics, and they want you to do R programming, and they want you to do Python programming, and then there's all these Python things. So whenever you teach bioinformatics, you make sure that you know how to run the Python codes which does this, that, and the other, right? So that whole notion of classical bioinformatics, we focus on single sequences, immediately extended to the genomic level, and this happened after the genomes were published. And then and then it was like 15 years ago they said, and we'll look at instructions of all of this. What is a microarray? Oh, microarrays were all the rage, right? GWAS, genome-wide association studies, and that all fell out of favor. And now it is things like RNA-seq or whole genome sequencing using next generation sequencing methods. And when you use next generation sequencing methods, then it's like, well, the reads that we get, there's a lot of statistical anomalies associated with those reads, because those reads are short reads. And short reads, there's a lot of potential random errors, because you take a read, and again, those of you who are finding all of this new, don't worry, we'll deal with this in detail in coming classes. But the idea is, oh, if the read is very short, there might be a read somewhere else. It introduces some randomness. So associating a read, even though it matches really well with a particular gene, does not necessarily mean that that gene is present or in some way implicated in whatever samples that we're looking for. That gene is probably there's a randomness. It's possible that there's another gene, where it might not have matched to it. Okay, now that's fine. Let's go into long read, right? Let's go into long read. PacBio says, okay, we've come up with something. Illumina, I'm sure, is working on it. Then you have Oxford Nanopore, which says we've got long read sequences. Long read sequences, it takes away that randomness, and now your long read is closer to a gene, and you'll have a better match to a gene than matching potentially two or three more genes. Now your implications of the gene contributions to whatever it is you're studying are a little more, right? Nobody ever thinks in terms of bioinformatics now with anything other than next generation sequencing. What happens 10 years from now, right? And so, and this is how it goes. All right, let's get back to the PowerPoint. Is another important thing that we have to be aware of is computational biology, and which is another term. So now you have to ask yourself, and again, we are not going to be any closer to distinguishing the two also. And how does it distinguish from bioinformatics? Okay, so all right, let's look at some definitions. So Dr. Nair, talking about it, says bioinformatics is biology plus computers, whereas computational biology equals computers plus biology. I'm sure that made it all very clear. Okay? Now, we go on to elaborate a little bit. In other words, biologists who specialize in use of computational tools and systems to answer problems of biology are bioinformaticians, whereas computer scientists, mathematicians, statisticians, and engineers who specialize in developing theory. So one is saying you have a biological problem, it's an identified biological problem, let's develop a tool to expedite its processing, let's to be able to deal with large amounts of data. On the other hand, if you use a discovery process, if you basically use computers to develop certain theories and algorithms and techniques, then those are computational biologists, right? So it's the theory that comes first, and then you develop notions of theory and then you can apply it. So that's computational biology. Bioinformaticians, on the other hand, look at a biological problem and identify a clearly definably identified biological problem and attempt to solve it. Now, let's take a side. There is a word that was used here, which I'll point out, and it is called as bioinformaticians, right? And so here's an aside. What's the difference between a bioinformatician versus a bioinformaticist? Okay, let's see whether, whether this is any better. So a bioinformaticist is an expert who not only knows how to use bioinformatics tools, but also knows how to write interfaces for effective use of the tools. So in one sense, this class is more about getting a theoretical understanding and knowing to use the tools associated with that understanding. On the other hand, my advanced bioinformatics class is how do you develop tools or interfaces, right? And so, but then that's kind of a computational biologist also. Then on the other hand, so that is a bioinformaticist. On the other hand, a bioinformatician, on the other hand, is a trained individual who only knows to use bioinformatics tools without a deeper understanding. Now, I'm sure that makes a bioinformatician feel really better that, hey, nobody expects you to understand anything beyond a certain point. Just sit in the corner and run a tool, right? So in the sense, it's almost like somebody who developed Excel, right? So whoever developed Excel in a visual Microsoft visual environment versus somebody who's like most of us, for example, who didn't develop PowerPoint or Word or thing, but we are users, and depending on your level of expertise, the level of experience, you could go from a regular user to somebody who can use to be a super user. And certainly, most of us, are what do they say that the amount of things that Word and Excel and PowerPoint that can be done in it, more 99% of the people can only use 10% of what is possible. And sometimes I do this. I say, okay, I want to do something. I want to do it in Excel. I don't quite know what the formula is, and I just type a Google how to do something in Excel, right? And certainly it shows up. But then you have in Word people who can write macros to small little program pieces to do the things they need to do, etc. Okay, so I've developed deliberately put this in this way: bioinformatics and computational biology. And so this is Russell Altman. Russell Altman is probably one of the people who's primarily responsible for, like, literally like the godfather of bioinformatics. He's the one who did a lot of the classical bioinformatics. He was the one who created a lot of the impetus towards some of this stuff, right? So bioinformatics is a creation of tools that solve problems. The goal is to build useful tools that work on biological data. It is about engineering. And then computational biology is a study of biology using computational techniques. The knowledge goal is to new biology, knowledge about living things. It is about science. Okay, so different words is one is more of a theoretical approach, the other one is more of a practical approach. Another definition by Michael Yu: one focused on computational pipelines and the implementation of theory for big data sets, whereas the other is focused on purely mathematical and computational theory. The question is which, right? So obviously the lower one is computational biology, where your approach is theoretical and then you apply it to a biological problem, whereas in bioinformatics you have a whether you are an advanced user or a user of tools, a super user, or an advanced user that understands the biology and develops a process to deal with it, that's what it is. Okay? Then you have, broadly speaking, computational biology, the application of computer science, statistics, and mathematics to problems in biology. And computational biology spans a wide range of fields within biology, including cell biology, genomics, genetics, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and then they use theoretical ideas, are developing theoretical ideas, and then have something. So they kind of are variations on the theme. So there was Lincolnstein. Lincolnstein, do I have it here? No. Lincolnstein, some time ago, um, uh, a year before that, he actually said bioinformatics is dead. Okay, and this is kind of an important philosophical point. The reason why he said that bioinformatics was dead was the genomes were coming out. They used these methodologies to identify genomes using high performance computing and things like that, shotgun sequencing and all of these things, right? And then everybody was left like in a room of people looking at each other, not knowing which way to go. And one of the things about not knowing which way to go was you said, what are we going to do with it? It looks like we have solved all the problems, right? And Lincoln Stein, this guy, said bioinformatics is dead. Okay, and then I guess once you realize that the applications of bioinformatics to the genomic level, large scale, high throughput, etc., were not were not immediately linearly scalable. That you had to do a lot more in terms of going from a single interaction to an ensemble interaction, which also, by the way, gave rise to the field of biostatistics. Before it was just a bunch of statisticians applying their ideas to biology, to the biological field. But once data became so advanced and evolved into such huge amounts of data, biostatisticians came into being to say that we need to make sure that the data is analyzed properly, is reproducible, it is statistically significant, etc. And that became such an important field that it became its own field. In fact, now if you look for a bioinformatics job, there seems to be a greater move towards asking for people to have biostatistics experience. So then what happens is once large scale, high throughput methodologies came along, Lincolnstein and the rest of the world realized that there was a lot going on, and therefore he says bioinformatics is alive and kicking. So if you going back to Latin, he used a little mea culpa thing, saying, "I'm sorry I said that, but now it's not." So he rewrote this thing again, and all of this was a while ago. So bioinformatics has become too central. So what is the point of it? He says that now you can't just say that I have a problem, biological problem, that cannot be solved in the lab. It needs the infusion of information technology. So I want to be able to go directly to I want to be able to go to a bioinformatics person. I don't know what that is. I don't care what that is. Those people are their own people. He didn't want to say that. He said that everybody has to be a bioinformatics person because there is so much development that goes on that you can't just say, I'm going to leave it to somebody else. You have to do a lot of the work itself. And having a lot of resources available on the web made life a lot easier because you have that same facility with, you take your phone, you go to wherever it is you want to go, you know exactly how to use it. And that's the kind of familiarity that all biologists should have, is what Lincolnstein is trying to say. I think this is the last slide because today is going to be a relatively short class, but I'll send the rest of the stuff. The philosophical underpinnings of this process. So bioinformatics is here to stay. Okay, there's a reason why when I was hired in this place 10 years ago, in our program, we didn't have a bioinformatics component. The bioinformatics was merely just kind of a utilitarian, practical approach. So my job was to create a bioinformatics class, and the idea is for you to say, it's here to stay. Okay, you don't have to be a bioinformatics. You can be a bench scientist, but there are some things. There's a lot of things in bioinformatics that you do not need to have. You do not have to go to an expert. Okay, you can be your own expert. Under the best of circumstances, the least thing you can do is attempt to be a super user. That's kind of the point of it, right? So whether whatever the domain of knowledge is, bioinformatics is not going to go away. So how does one reconcile bioinformatics with the mainstay experimentation, right? I mean, despite all the definitions of computational biology, life sciences is all about experimenting. Bioinformatics cannot supplant it. Bioinformatics is supportive of it, even though you kind of develop theories and things like that. So the idea is when you walk away from this class, now we cannot teach you all the web resources. That's not possible. But once you deal with the main ones, you can say, okay, now I kind of know how to use it, so I can go to things that I don't know and still get over that activation state fear, and you say, I'm going to be able to use it. And again, if you say, now I want to start touching into the developmental side of things, then you have class like BTEC 5333, which is Advanced Bioinformatics, which I teach kind of like this in spring. Okay. So it aims to make you aware that there is so much bioinformatics development going on that you can use web accessible abilities to help in 80% of what you need as you develop your scientific abilities. And now, you can go to almost any uh, paper, and if there's done even the slightest informatics related thing, they will actually say here's a web page where you can go and try it and use it and things like that. You can take it a step further, and I think, like, bioinformatics, computational biology, BMC bioinformatics, all the development that happens in these resources have a web resource that you can typically use. Okay, then there are these aggregators, right? For example, NCBI has all these resources, and we look at some of them. NCBI has all these resources that every year they put more stuff on there that you can actually do a Google search or do an NCBI search. On the other hand, something like XPASY, which is used to be called SwissProt, which is purely for proteins, every year they put they've got several hundred resources which allow you to do so many things, all available on the web. Okay, there is a journal, Nucleic Acid Research. Nucleic Acid Research has, I think, in the first issue, used to always be called the database issue, where some of the more established databases would just write a paper about their upgrades, but there would be so many new databases to the point that now it's not the first issue anymore. The first issue, rather than call it the first issue related to publications, they call it the database issue, and it's a specialized issue. Similarly, there's one published in the middle of the year somewhere and I know because I published in it several years ago. There is a web-based issue which actually talks about web resources. So any kind of PubMed search, if you want to do something, it'll eventually, you do the search and it'll take you to one or many other resources, and you can just go to the resource and use it. Okay, so there's no excuse to say, well, I don't know, right? Because it's just like, it's about as simple sometimes as using a Google search. And once you've used some of the resources, then you do not have to worry about using new resources, right? You immediately begin to get a familiarity with it. That little, as I said, that little activation state, that little fear that comes from putting your feet into the unknown kind of goes away, because you say, I've used one, I can use the other. And I think that is the end of the class. We would have been kicked out anyway. For next class, I'm going to try and find out exactly why I can't use 3 hours. But today's was more of an introductory class. I will send you the link to this video as soon as it's uploaded. I will send you some reading material also. I would recommend you read it, and I think there will be one short, very very short homework or maybe a long homework. I'll have to think about it. But let me look at the chat, or somebody can unmute and ask if you have any questions. If not, then we can adjourn for the day, and I'll see you next week. Any questions? Yeah, thank you, Michaela. It was Grammarly, but in the middle of it, yeah, Michaela, and then everybody else. Every communication is going to be via email. So it's your responsibility then to make sure that you check the email once every day or twice every day, and respond accordingly. Saying that you didn't read your email or didn't get your email is unfortunately not an excuse. Okay, that's the only way I can communicate. I know that every time I teach a class, they've got Blackboard. I use Blackboard in another lecture, but I don't think any of the faculty who are at the Center for Biotechnology, none of the BTEC, the biotech courses, does anybody use Blackboard. I use Blackboard for an undergraduate class. but now Blackboard is being ported onto Canvas, so there's going to be a big learning curve associated with that. The email are generally okay. On the other hand, being a TTO graduate student, um, there's no real excuse not to be able to say I didn't check the email. That works with undergraduates. It doesn't work. I'm not going to create an Instagram channel just so I can communicate with you. Uh, if I used Black, if I this is an online, exclusively online class, like an asynchronous online class, then the Blackboard will try and force me to use something called the discussion section and things like that. And I mean, I think we can do all the discussions we want here. I do not have to have a discussion class. So Yujia is trying to say something, so we'll wait and see. Is the homework due by next class? It depends upon the length of the homework. If it's sometimes I might say I want the homework in another half hour. In fact, this homework will probably be due in another hour. Sometimes if the homework is kind of hard and it's going to be time consuming, I might ask the homework to be might take longer. Um, but but uh, Sometimes I might give you 1 week, I might give you 2 weeks. But when the homework is given to you, Yuchia, I will tell you exactly what the due date and time is. Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you very much. I will see you guys next week. Unless you have any questions, doubts, etc. Feel free to email me or knock on the door. Again, email is better. Most days I will not have an issue unless I'm in the middle of something. It should be okay. All right. I'm going to end the meeting now and we can go from there. Bye. Thank you.